Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
Broadcast from later, where we discuss how the weak signals emerging in the present may influence the future's unfolding. Today, I'm joined by Udit Vera, Macy Sue, Valdez Sillens, and Erica White. Udit, what's the weakest signal on your radar?
Yeah, so my weakest signal is basically comes from this conversation I was having a few weeks ago where someone used this phrase, and I was reflecting on it over the last couple of weeks, which was, they said this phrase, polishes broken capitalism. And basically it was this idea that feeling that your work needs to be complete and polished, as you put it out, is a problem with contemporary capitalism. But I don't want to focus on that point too much. I think the signal there was this idea that I've been noticing that people have been putting out unfinished work in the sort of drafts more and more so in the public and sort of working in the public. And I've been seeing this in a number of places. This is big in sort of the tech community, like the indie game dev community, for example, has this Twitter hashtag called Screenshot Saturday, where they just show their work in progress. Like the indie hacker crew do this thing where they build in public, where they show their brand as they're developing it, show their features as they're developing new features for their web applications, and so on. And so so my idea is basically this notion of being positive with sharing your drafts early. And I've been calling it draft positivity.
Draft positivity, a play on like sex positivity or
any other kind of positivity. Being comfortable being in draft form.
Being comfortable being in draft form. It's kind of beautiful for all of us, unfinished products.
So I heard an interview with some scientists the other day who was talking about how preprints, which are basically like drafts in science form, cause a lot of controversy because people assume that they're going to be proven right. And there are still like mechanisms of peer review and other things that it has to go through before it can be published. And in that time, it can actually turn out that some of the initial claims were like proven to be off. And so this person was talking about the challenge of like trying to be open, but then having a public like latch onto and interpret your draft form as though it was like a finished form. So it feels like there needs to be like draft literacy as well as draft positivity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But isn't it also like in the scientific community that people are sharing their like sort of methods and approach before they publish their paper? There's been this big drive to publish your method and approach before you actually go and run your analysis, just so that people can ensure that you're not like hacking your results or like cherry picking or whatever to prove your original hypothesis, which is like almost the opposite, which is like sharing your draft early. And there's like a reason for that, which is to show that you have thought through your approach and you have a good sort of research design.
Do you think people have the time to check people's like ongoing things? Like it's a good idea, but like the amount of like attention scarcity and time demands that people have. I'm just saying that because I know like the replicability crisis in the social sciences relates to like people just not having the time to check any of this stuff. And then when they started doing it, they were like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like half of this doesn't repeat.
I'm not sure about this. I'll have to go and check. But I think there's certain journals that like ask you to send in your like a research design before you even do it, instead of just like accepting your final results and publishing your paper once it's done. So I think like payment for like peer review is sort of built into whatever financial structure there is. Like I think there's like a lot of problems with how like peer review happens and how it sort of that whole cycle works, and like the incentives behind like journals and so on are the questions around how to make sure that all that information is available publicly and so on. But still, I think the fact that there are these journals who are trying to find ways to review your design and drafts before you actually send in your results is, I think, interesting. But when I brought this idea forward, it wasn't just in scientific publishing and publishing in general. I think this is like more just happening broadly. And like one of the places where I've been seeing this too more recently is this idea of the folk web that I think is coming back, where people are creating these like really sort of like artisanal, handmade websites online. I've seen this notion of the web ring, which is popular in like the 90s and 2000s, come back, which is just like a way to like collect like amateur websites and connect them all together so that from one you can go to the other. And then this other notion of digital gardens, where you have like these like little sort of web pages where you have your your notes and your work in progress all kind of like curated in one place. Examples of that would be like Gorn, that is quite famous. Like people know Gorn's website, where he has like all his like working drafts like just publicly visible and curated.
Yeah, there's like a few examples of this, I think, over the years. Like I can see this kind of leading up to being something that, you're identifying as like even maybe a strong signal of change now. And it's funny on the web, like the earliest, like the whole notion of under construction, which was
Yeah.
like an artifact of like the GeoCities age of
Yeah.
yeah.
Man, I've been seeing people using NeoCities a lot more, which is
Oh,
like
really?
the redo of
Like
GeoCities.
the nostalgia for like a past web, or like having a web that's more iterative when things are so centralized.
Hmm.
Kind of this desire for decentralizing the web in some capacity. But I've definitely heard of like social media being like a forest, and then these like iterations, these like work in public techniques are then like this way to navigate that forest. So then you have like these different spheres of like the dark forest and how to navigate that. So also it's like a process of navigation, I think is
Hmm.
interesting.
When you say navigation, meaning that like it's like a form of curation, right? Like when people create
Curation.
these gardens.
Yeah, and navigating that unfinished draft as well, I'd say, because it's unfinished, right?
Yeah.
So
Also just like insights into internal process. Like it reminds me of how authors' notebooks being published, and it's so cool like seeing their notes in the margins, or seeing like books that they've read and the notes that they've made, or a draft of published like renowned books, and you're seeing like the changes that have been made
Hmm.
and the author's own process and like the challenges that they went through, or where they place emphasis and how that changed.
Hmm.
So maybe that wayfinding could be tied to what are the markers in the draft that you are paying attention to, and how are those markers changing as well, and what's influencing that.
Tracking versioning is kind of like an interesting part of this in creative works now versus just having like these notes that get republished like well after work has been deemed like great or something like that. I wonder if there's like an argument to be made that our mentalities around perfection and publication are just now catching up to like read write technology. And an example I think of is like there was the Kanye West Life of Pablo album several years ago where he put out these like early iterations, and it was like SoundCloud uploads, and even I think you maybe not everyone was able to do this with as much ease, but on the streaming platforms like would update the album several times over.
Yeah.
I don't know, just the iterations of that. It was just sort of like something. Yeah, of course you can do that.
Yeah.
It's not like we haven't pressed like a million copies of vinyl or whatever, or if we have like the next set can change, and it's just something that you would only see it in really small like novelty ways, like oh the next edition of this album has one bonus song, or like
Yeah.
something, or it's the 25th anniversary edition has been remastered, or like really not particularly exciting or creative ways, whereas like that was like real time updating it, changing the chorus, changing the voices on the record, changing all these versions are out. It's also interesting, I think, from that like people have whatever version they downloaded when, or whatever is the track they know, versus there being like one established fixed version, which maybe there is now in terms of what's on Spotify, but not what's in people's heads. So
Yeah.
it's like creates a difference.
I wonder how like version control comes in then, and like how that ties in with like the draft. So like as different versions are coming out and it's being disseminated, or like people are renaming things and stuff like that, how do you I guess like part of putting it out there is that you're not so worried about it, but that tension between wanting to control quality and also wanting to just have it out there and getting feedback.
I think like where this sort of draft work has been happening a lot, that I'm aware of at least, and this has to do with my own biases, is in open source and tech, where people have been working in the open for a long, long time, right? And like they've created very particular tools around it. Git being the really famous one, which is a version control and collaboration tool at the same time, where you're sharing drafts and versioning them and seeing other people's changes and so on. Has like pretty robust version control, and many others too.
Interesting bringing up Google Docs, because I'm always like fascinated at looking at the different word processor tools and stuff. And I always think of like Microsoft Word is like a bad version of InDesign, but Microsoft Word is a publishing tool that's not very good, rather than a writing tool primarily. Whereas like I use Scrivener, a writing tool primarily, a publishing tool secondary. Google Docs is like a collaboration tool, but it's interesting to see how all these things get repurposed. Like for a long time, Microsoft Word was just a default writing tool or whatever, even if it wasn't built for that. Google Docs is now often by us and by many people being repurposed as a publishing tool, even in a more extreme way. Like it's both the sort of tool for formatting the publication, but that's not where its capabilities are. Its capabilities are in the sharing of the publication because it's online in a way that Microsoft Word or whatever is not. And so using it as a way to publish, and this notion of living document that we have been hearing more and more, I think, in recent years, and that we've used publications like ARC. It's like a website that just diverts directly to a Google Slides presentation that's live, and we're tracking versions. I like the metaphor or phrase that I've heard you use of working with the garage door open.
Yeah, it's not mine. I got it from Andy Masachek, but yeah.
Good way to think about this signal. And I'm curious, would it wait for you on like a personal level, what polishes broken capitalism or working with the garage door open?
I've been thinking about this a lot. I think it's interesting. I think like working in public forces you to navigate certain questions about like what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Managing perception, like forcing you to communicate better because you're thinking about, how it's going to be read by other people as you put it out. Before I used to find it challenging, I think, working in public a little bit because, I would be questioning whether it's having a sort of chilling effect on my creativity, whether I'm like holding myself back because other people are seeing it. But I think it's actually a constraint, and constraints are good for creativity. So, that's the way I've been thinking about it.
I like that description. The first thing that came to mind was like when you were speaking about music, how stems kind of come out as like snippets of a track, and then someone releases those and they're then collected in like different mixes or whatever, and then a full compilation of like a track is made. And I like comparing it to that because then it can come back to you or it may not, but it's still generative in some capacity, I guess.
If this is a signal, like what do we think it signals in terms of where this is going?
This isn't at all answering your question, but I think back to
no need to answer my questions.
Blogging, and just like the way that was also seen as a way of like working in public, and everyone looks back nostalgically at it, and a lot of people are like, why did this disappear? Like what destroyed it? And obviously the advent of social platforms is like a big part of that, like Facebook and Twitter and all of that stuff. But that infrastructure still exists and like isn't particularly being used.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there are lessons to be learned. I don't have any insights because like I was like too young to like use it through its heyday.
The Google Reader era.
LiveJournal.
Yeah, I was going to say LiveJournal is like the thing that comes to mind,
But what about like things like Substack? Like it feels like everybody has a newsletter now.
I was just going to say that. So it's like a branded version of your rough thoughts.
Yeah.
I think people are complaining though, because it's like we went from like a world where like you could aggregate all that stuff on some external platform to one where now your like inbox is just flooded with like these essentially like this weight on your attention, which you have to deal with. And like I don't actually like newsletters because of that. Like I don't like having my inbox filled with things that I'm not in the mood to read right now, and I don't know where to put them.
I'm wondering if there'll be like a platform or something that manages that, something like Feedly, like how Feedly like.
Well, the thing is, like, this is why I brought up the digital gardens notion, because I think I love those. That's like my favorite way. Look at like new ideas or come across new ideas. Like the fact that this person has like curated these ideas, but also like curated, designed a sort of like interface as well, like arrange it in a certain way. And like I think that also reveals like new mental models and new like sort of meta ideas behind like how the concepts are presented, right? I honestly prefer like these like one-off folksy versions of curation to anything that would happen on a centralized platform like Substack, where it all kind of like mashes together and we're seeing more of the sort of like attention problems that I have on platforms like Twitter and so on, where you have this like so much context collapse, so much overwhelming information. So I don't know, I'm like more excited to see digital gardens, like those kinds of things, than anything else.
So can you define digital garden?
Oh, a digital garden is like somebody's like website where they've like, you know, it's like their...
I feel like you should just stop somebody's website.
Yeah, somebody's website.
I feel like that is kind of what
it's somebody's website where they've like put together their thoughts, like put a bunch of links and arrange them in their sort of format.
It's kind of like how people are using Arena.
Kind of.
There's a little bit more aggregation, I guess, in Arena. Like
It's a little more limited.
The UX is more constrained. Like you have a lot more freedom on your own website to arrange information in the way you want. Think about it as like a digital bulletin board where you are designing the canvas, you're designing the bulletin board, and you're designing what content goes on it. That's the way I would think about it.
And it's not a particular platform or anything. Is that the idea? Digital Gardens?
No, it's just somebody's website. It's just like this idea of a personal website where you're using your website to curate the internet.
Yeah, it's a website in the like 90s sense of I have a web page. Like
yes, exactly.
I kind of thought it was not a website, and it was more so just like the planting of ideas in different like areas, or not necessarily having it in one space, but like just kind of throwing all the ideas out there in different spaces.
Maybe that's a verb version, which is digital gardening.
Yeah.
Versus your digital garden. Maybe I have the term wrong, but I'm thinking of personal websites which you use as a digital bulletin board.
I like where Erica's taking it too. That's like the digital seed bombing or like something where it's like your entire sort of online footprint or whatever as a curatorial activity.
All the crumbs.
Digital bird feed. Signal or noise, fathers?
Yeah, I think Signal, because I think I've seen stuff like it, and I don't think we answered like what it means, which is the question I avoided when you asked, like Rob, like what it means for the future, because it's like I see a lot of issues, like the open source community is like infamously has like a lot of issues with demands on people's attention by working in public all the time. What are the kinds of dynamics that this will mean for like everyday people? It's like there's a lot to explore, so I'll call it Signal, but I would say of what I'm not sure.
Maisie?
Similar vein, I guess. I think it's interesting. I think the things that are popping up is interesting. I think it's a good notion to think about, like working more openly. And I think it's also in terms of thinking about access and different layers of publicness, all of those things. But I can't identify one thing. I'm just thinking about dimensions or things to think about or implications.
Erica, Signal or noise?
I think it's a signal because I think it's an interesting way in terms of like empowering your own system of knowledge. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that generally people are thinking about in terms of working online or working publicly. So I do think it's a signal.
I'm going to say it's at least a useful concept. And I don't know that it's a signal in the sense of that I believe it's totally indicative of anything new. Like, in some ways, it's a lot of these ideas have been talked about easily as long as the entire history of the internet. And some ways they've played out in interesting ways, and sometimes they haven't. And sometimes it's been really, like in the example of like the Life of Pablo album, it like took surprisingly long for someone to exploit the possibilities of the technology at a large sort of scale audience level. This conversation took me to a lot of ideas around platform aesthetics, I'll call it, and how those differ in various platforms. And I think actually from platform to platform online, there's a lot of indications of, certain spaces that people are much more polished positive or caring about pristine. And then there also seems like there's so much need for both. Like if this is a signal of anything dangerous, which we haven't explored too much here, it could be a signal of like when transparency goes wrong or something like that, which there's so much opportunity for that to happen in the sciences, in one's personal blogging, in all of these areas, right? And there is different types of pressures put on you through, working with the garage door open or whatever. It can stunt certain people. So it could go either way, but I'm going to be contrarian and say noise. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
Mine is something called a special guest, and they call themselves a video conferencing marketplace where you can have unusual and wonderful guests for hire. And the idea is to Zoom bomb from a better world. And I think it's just in thinking about different ways that meetings can be disrupted or fixing some of the ways that meetings are already broken, and having these guests bring special skills and abilities to add to your meeting or your way of working or your process of working, and invite you to imagine other ways of gathering, being together, or collaborating. So it's essentially archetypes or different personalities, and you don't know who exactly you'll get, but the person who comes in is supposed to deliver that personality. So they have people like the questioner, where have you lost your purpose? Why are you here? The questioner will ask the most important question at all the most important moments, or there's a scapegoat, so everything is always their fault. So it's like, did you delete a database? Where is that report? The scapegoat will take the fall for any problem and will even make up a reason on the spot. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting in terms of thinking about ways of working, and there's also like a performative aspect to it as well, I think, from both sides. And it's a marketplace, so it's like the potential or the business model behind it, or the thought around the business model behind it, in terms of bringing work to artists or performers. Yeah, all of those things are interesting, but interested to hear your thoughts as well.
So are they basically supposed to be prompts within the supposed meeting then?
Yeah, I guess so. But some of them is like the tea time, which is like forgot to take breaks, losing steam. It's tea time. So yeah, I think you can treat it as it could be a creative prompt, or it can be like there's like the decision maker. So if you know the group has trouble making decisions, but it's also in the gray zone between like, is it actually useful or is it just provocative?
I mean, some of it's so hilarious. The idea at a large organization that you could sneak someone in, have no one really realize that this person doesn't even work for your company, and have them be your scapegoat for like for that reply all or whatever. Like it was the new guy doesn't actually work here. Like, it's so funny.
So it's supposed to be a secret, like it's not supposed to be.
But it's not clear. I think you could go either way. I think there's a lot of settings when it could work. I think it's a signal of so many things, from like just like even this type of marketplace, definitely the just uselessness of so many meetings. Like, it's kind of a big comment on how many meetings are a waste of time. I think that the idea that you can just bring in like someone with no real business per se.
It reminds me of like when you do like work group activities and you go on like team building, thank you, and you go on quests and stuff. You can do like adventures where you like meet different actors and stuff around the city, and it's like a team building activity, and they hire actual actors to then like play through this narrative.
It's like going to an escape room, but for like the virtual COVID era.
There's like a whole tradition of consulting techniques or whatever that are based on that, like the improv thing that was mentioned at one point. Like this tradition of like bringing those kinds of people into organizations to shake them up and like change the dynamics and get people to act out different roles. And,
putting on different hats.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. The more radical side to this, at least for me, is to like think about, is any kind of signal about like further disaggregating the kind of gig work that is possible within organizations, so that like you no longer have to hire people full time who are like only there to be scapegoats, or only there to be problem solvers, or only there to be, I don't know what other kinds of categories they have. I'm being like kind of half joking, but it makes me wonder, is that possible?
I know, I think that idea is so fun and interesting. Just like a fully decentralized workplace. When I say decentralized, I mean like there's no like fixed group of people, fixed team, right? It's just like a random group of people every
just
time.
5 hired employees.
Yeah, just showing up.
In terms of like having the possibility of the roles developing into something, it's really fun and interesting, like bringing someone in and testing out a new role or something. That's pretty fun.
Yeah, just like trying new dynamics for your team.
I want to say that it can be a signal towards like more quote creative like meeting holding, but I think our understanding of like what makes a meeting work, like we kind of already have it. It's like keep them very short, have a very clear agenda, and like preferably write out ahead of time what the main thing is that people can either like glance over, or at the very least it forces you to structure what it's going to be about, as opposed to like making it more creative. That's like, from what my understanding of the research, like the way to make meetings more effective. But then it makes me wonder if this is like a signal of just like extroverts going a little crazy in the COVID era. And, like,
I like that interpretation.
Yeah.
Extroverts going crazy in the COVID era. Yeah.
Is it like when Zoom fatigue, almost a remedy to Zoom fatigue as well? Like, how do we spice up this Zoom meeting?
Zoom spice. I like that.
What about all the filters? You can be a banana on your Zoom meeting. Isn't that spice enough? You need labor for spice too. You need to have somebody actually doing something.
You need a personified banana.
Yeah, you can be the banana, but can you be the banana?
Right.
Can you really be a banana?
I think this is a really fun signal. I think it signals like meeting kind of becoming like the unit of knowledge work. Like it just like has so much like potential. We're thinking about organizational dynamics, social physics within organizations and things like that that I think I'm like interested to see what these folks come up with.
The future of the meeting factory. It's the decentralized meeting factory. Okay. Erica, you think a signal or noise?
I think it's a signal because I've never like heard of anything like that, not outside of Zoom, but like I just think it's a really interesting way to play with a meeting and to have like a incognito person or a random person play within like whatever field you're in. I just think it's fun.
Yeah, I like it a lot as a signal of new ways of working, ways of organizing, ways of outsourcing, ways of insourcing. I think it's cool, and I think it's a signal. Erica, what's your weakest signal?
There's this company called Peaches, and it basically is a car and fashion company trying to revamp the culture around vehicles and cars. So they basically delve into like a bit of the fashion, a little bit of like graphic design, but then they also do auto body work and trying to make cars like the next Stussy, or what's another example? I'll go with Stussy. Yeah, they're trying to be like the next Stussy of vehicles, apparently. So I'm not sure where it fits exactly, but it seems like they're trying to go for a bit of like a cyberpunk thing, maybe even like a cyber pop thing. But yeah, that's where I'm at with it. Again, a little bit scrambled with where it fits. But apparently there wasn't much of a car culture or like this type of car culture in Korea. So it's fairly new.
So is it their own cars? Like, do they make their own cars, or is it just like more of...
They're styling it.
They're styling like much like a Fast and the Furious type situation where it's like they're adding like certain types of graffiti, or like they're basically found in music videos, and it's just like this culture around like fashion, but then also vehicles. There's like this connection between auto body and making it fashion.
And sorry, what's it called, or what's the?
It's called Peaches. It has a bit of like a like hyper fashion vibe for me, but it's definitely leaning heavy into like cyberpunk. And I've also been reading about like there's this rise of cyberpunk because of COVID and because of like people being like just trying to like regain some sense of like creativity.
Right.
But yeah, that's where I'm at so far with that. It has also this feeling of like a repair culture, again, like a revamp of some sort of repair culture around vehicles.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some of these vehicles around where I don't even really know how they're doing it, but the paint job is like chrome or something. Like the whole car is looks like a metallic, very reflective metallic, like mirrored surface, which seems to be the aesthetic of some of these.
A lot of the images that I've seen look like they've been rendered, so they don't necessarily look real, but they are.
Yeah, I think in real life they look
edited.
rendered almost. Yeah.
And like, what's the connection with fashion? Is there like a clothing line also? Do they have clothing lines, or is it just like...
Yeah, I think it's that they view themselves also as a fashion company. So I guess the connection is that oftentimes you'll see cars in spaces of like fashion or at like runway shows or whatever. The cars are then like a part of their a part of the owner's like personality and like how they identify with their like expressing themselves outwardly. So I think it's like accessorizing almost. It's like viewed as like an accessory as well.
Right.
The maker basically said that he based off of the emoji.
The peach emoji.
That I think is interesting.
It's also tied more to like streetwear culture that has like more of like a pro brand vibe, which like cars, because they're very obviously like there's no craft cars out there. They're all just like a few brands. Because it looks like they hype up like Lambos and Ferraris and stuff like that too. Just from like looking them up, like it's like sports cars or like street sports cars.
I kind of found it odd, the youth luxury bit. Some of the writing has mentioned that like because real estate wasn't much of like an issue for millennials, that they were just spending money on cars instead. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Can you say more on that? Like they're no longer spending money on real estate, which is why they have this sort of like...
Specifically in Korea, that real estate wasn't much of like a desire.
Oh, and desire, right.
So that they ended up spending more on vehicles, or that vehicles were said to be more desirable for millennials. But I'm not sure if that's like a branding thing as well.
Interesting. I was just going to go back to the idea that Valdez had, which is there being no craft culture in the auto industry, which I think is like really interesting. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is like thinking of cars as computers. And like when computers first came about, which is what we're seeing right now in the car industry right now, right? The fact that they're getting all electrified is basically, they're all computers. Like the Teslas are computers on wheels, right? That's what they are. And when we had this beginning of computer culture, PC culture, it was very craft oriented. Like people had their own versions of what these things were. And yeah, I've like wondered whether we're going to see that in cars more too, because there's new ways to sort of change the functionality, but also you can think about new ways to sort of change the entire sort of body as well. You can think about the drivetrain and like all the sort of functional aspect of it as just like a platform over which you can build kind of anything, and that might be more sort of replaceable in the same way that like a motherboard for a computer is like a platform that can go inside and be changed in many different ways, which we see in like PC culture, right? Like people have these towers that are so like elaborate and
Yeah.
like water cooled and like all this stuff.
Homebrew car club.
The homebrew car club, yeah.
It's interesting. A lot of this feels very like full circle. Like
Yeah, it is full circle.
It's interesting even with the streetwear side of things. It's so interesting that streetwear really, you could argue, fully came from car culture. And Erica, we've talked about this guy Ed Big Daddy Roth, who was famous for painting hot rods and like
Yeah.
really and making not just painting. Eventually, I think painting them and then eventually creating a lot of like futuristic concept cars that like I think like the Homer car on The Simpsons with the bubble domes and everything was like kind of influenced by some of his like hot rod concepts and cars of the future and stuff. But car clubs used to wear these particular types of jackets. And when it sort of started, I think more in like Detroit, and that was like hot rod culture, and which was all about souping up cars and like building around the chassis and everything. But when that moved to LA, it was too hot to wear these car club jackets, and that was literally the beginning of graphic T-shirts because there was all these like customized painting and stuff like that. Graphic T-shirts with like characters on them and all that kind of stuff were fully born out of car clubs and decorating their unique like car club like uniform or whatever.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I love that little tidbit.
And then it's like, yeah, it's just interesting that maybe now streetwear becomes an input into how cars are designed, which I don't know, from some of the images I'm seeing of this, it definitely makes sense. I definitely see what you mean with fashion and sort of how certain styles are reappropriated. Like I'm seeing some of these images, looks like they're like referencing graphics from like the US Postal Service or things like that in sort of like tongue-in-cheek ways. And I feel like just a few years ago in the fashion world, you were seeing like, you know, DHL uniforms on the runway and like Home Depot like logos on clothing and things like that. Like this sort of new high fashion appropriation of work uniforms and even like nostalgic graphics and sort of institutional graphics and stuff, which seems to be happening in some of these images too.
I also think it's resonated just because it's so drastically different from, or not drastically different, but it contrasts maybe like some of the other ways people are thinking about car ownership or even like transportation infrastructure. Like it's not new in any way, but it is like a revamp, I guess is what I was trying to say.
You saying the thing that's different is that people think about cars as for their aesthetic value and less for their function, something like that, or like I'm
yeah,
understand.
Yeah, no, I think it's like going back to. Sorry, I lost my thought there. I'm not sure actually.
But I think yeah, it's like a form of self-expression, which I feel like was totally lost, at least in North American car culture. Most of it. I mean, I would say in a city like Toronto, where we live, is like one among the worst. And it's starting to change. There is like, I think, at least in the suburbs, more of this sort of like different car meets and car cultures happening. But like in general, it's like the options if you're going to buy a car for what's out there is all the same shapes, all the same colors, all like it's so dull. And even what the brands sort of signify, these minor variations in like status and, you know, utility, that like there's very little room for any sort of expression. And then you go visit, you know, wherever in the world, Pakistan, the Philippines, Mexico, like, and see what people are doing in terms of customizing and personalizing their vehicles. And it's just like some really beautiful work being done.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like the trucker art culture in Pakistan is huge.
Yeah.
And I think that ties really well with like what we were talking in terms of craft, because it's almost like artisanal. It's so detailed and all like handmade additions to the car.
Yeah, I think there's something there about like repair. Like if some sort of major damage happened to your car, if you would end up just buying a new car or whatever. But the idea of like taking the scraps from an old vehicle and then either building a new car or readjusting it to some degree, I think it's worthwhile.
With cars and computers now on a lot of these sides, and I don't know with, you know, some of these particular vehicles, how replaceable are the parts? My understanding
Yeah.
is it's way less than it used to be, and on
It
the Mac
is way
it's way
less
less.
because of like the way a lot of the parts are like directly soldered onto like the motherboards, and they have like these new sort of unibody formats where everything is just one thing. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like like people have been talking about right to repair, because it's not just like from a technical point of view, but also the legal side, where a lot of these big companies, and companies like Apple in particular, like kind of limit the sorts of modifications you can do to their technology. And while actually you all were talking about like craft paintings on cars in South Asia, like the truck art and stuff, I was thinking about the Jaguar cars in India. So the hand painted trucks are huge in India. They're everywhere. But also, there's a lot of like these Jaguar cars. So Jaguar, if you don't know, is like the homegrown sort of repair culture in India, where you take the word literally translates to hacking. And like in my experience, I've seen like people taking like old like hand pumps, electric hand pumps, and or diesel hand pumps, and converting them into cars by literally adding them to like a bullock cart that you would use for transporting produce or whatever. That stuff like really excites me. Like I want to see what happens when we have all these new sort of like electronic technologies that are going to be repurposed in new ways in places where they have a culture of repurposing. And this reminds me of like Cuba too. Like Cuba has an incredibly rich car hacking culture.
Yeah.
Because of like the trade embargoes that were in place for many years. Rob, going back to your point about constraints and limitations of like what is possible with these new technologies, I think those constraints also add new like creative potentials. I'm like really curious to see how people hack these unibody things and these like soldered on like motherboards and whatever in new ways.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. Following the threads of car culture is really interesting, and just like how, like I think of with like just in through the 90s and through like hip hop culture, the like lowrider thing in LA, the slabs, like as they're called in Texas. There's been all of these different waves, and then like the sort of like various sort of like Asian car cultures that I've been seeing, like import cars and things like that. I should say like Asian Canadian in terms of what I'm referring to.
Yeah, the Daisy car scene is cool.
Yeah, exactly. The Daisy car culture here in Toronto. They all have sort of their own aesthetics, their own functional and aesthetic sort of values, I guess.
Well, there's also like racing and stuff, right? Which is illegal, but it happens.
Yeah. It's been happening, and that's like one of those. So Valdez, your signal about audio recently. It's like during the sort of quietness of lockdown, it was so obvious when you'd hear someone out there like taking advantage of like the empty streets and like speeding around and
doing donuts and
or whatever. Yeah. Okay, signal or noise. Noted.
I think there's a lot of rich conversation there. I'm not sure what like Peaches is a signal of. I'm not. Yeah, but again, I'm like really interested in like the sort of creative potential in the new electric cars that we're going to see. So that's what I'm excited for. And so I'd say it's a signal of that, maybe. Yeah.
Macy, signal or noise?
I'm interested in looking at it as a signal for leveraging repair culture as self-expression.
Nice. Valdez?
I've just like been looking at a few photos and stuff, and I don't really see like any electric cues, repair cues, or I always thought that word was Jugad. What was the word you used? How do you pronounce it?
Jugad.
Jugad. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, like that kind of like making do innovation that goes on, where you're just kind of like hacking do, like bricoleur style hacking pieces together, like actual cyberpunk functionality, you know, having 8 phones in your car or whatever, and like making them do different things and whatnot. I think that stuff is really cool. But this instance, I think, is, I'm not sure what it is. The only thing I think of is like the extended waves of export of a certain kind of like Americanized agonistic culture that like has all these layers to it, that it's interesting how it circulates around the world. And I think Korea has like obviously had like a strong like hip hop culture for throughout the 2000s, and this is like another piece to it. It's not Americanization because it's like it morphs when it goes somewhere else. It becomes something different. But it's interesting to see this kind of like particularly, the reason I say American is because like there's a particular like agonism in America that I think is represented in the kind of like status contests that these like cars and streetwear culture kind of like, to me, signifies.
What is agonism?
it's like competition between people, but like a sense of like, I don't think it means like you destroy your enemy. I think it's like you kind of become better through the dynamics of that agonism between you.
Oh,
Whereas a lot of cultures, it's like if you stand out, you kind of like go down. Like you're not supposed to stand out in that way.
or in this case, is it wagonism?
I mean, I don't have the details of the specific word, but I would pretty much agree with what you said.
Yeah, I don't know. It's exciting. It's a world I have had very little experience with, but I like find it cool and interesting. And in general, it's like the car is a sort of canvas that's there that like it seems really like underutilized, and it's like kind of sad that it's so dull. And maybe it's the way people dress is exactly the same in general. Like everybody's more or less dressed the same anyways. And so in fashion, you only do have these like rare examples of like people who really make a point of putting a lot into how they express themselves through their clothes and how they express themselves sartorially. But I'll go with it saying that I think there's a signal of something interesting in terms of what the future of cars is. Like I think I could interpret this as cars becoming more of a recreational first idea, and that this is like your car. Like I don't know, this term this friend of mine told me. He's a Mexican American man from Los Angeles, and he has a phrase that they use called dominguero, which is like it means like your Sunday car, and it's like your car that you only drive on Sunday. It's more for like show, almost like a Sunday like outfit or something like that. It's like the special car. It's not your everyday one. It's the one you work on and the one that you bring out for show. And I think that's like an idea that could be coming from like a post like petronormative. It doesn't come from, but could become like an indication of a post petronormative future where like cars are part of culture first and part of like transportation second, but cease to make sense from an environmental standpoint, and much more of a project than like a mass produced kind of thing. On the other hand, you could say this is like the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And things, I think COVID maybe would be like part of where, yeah, the idea that you can kind of Gary Newman, like in my car, I feel safe, like drive off to somewhere right now. It seems really appealing to people. And a lot of people, I think car sales are up overall. So in contrast with what I was just saying. So I feel like it's a really interesting and a complex of other like automobile futures signals right now. So like we're just within that industry. It's a cool signal. Valdez, what's your weakest signal?
I was looking at this like nuclear influencer who is this like, I think she's Brazilian model or like maybe Ukrainian or something, one of those exotic places where models come from. And she lives in LA now. And from what I understand, this is like a Vice article, she stopped doing the kind of like standard influencing, which like consists of travel and food and stuff like that, and then switched to this really weird like pro nuclear energy mission. And so like she hosts these like live stream sessions where she talks about like the details of, I don't know, what is it, third generation reactors, whatever the one is that they haven't like done yet that they're like about to do, which is often the story with nuclear. And so like diving into all the details, like accounting for the risk and why it's like irrational, why we think about why we don't count, the risk that comes from carbon and the amount of like people that die every year from that kind of infrastructure. She talked about like the science behind it, the future, obviously the relationship to the climate. And so she has this kind of like mission driven influencing program, but the influencing is like, I don't know. I don't think she monetizes any of the nuclear stuff yet so far in terms of like, there's no sponsors as far as I know. And so as a signal, I think I was just curious about, I guess, a lot of things like the rise of like niche peer-to-peer learning communities online and how people are sharing knowledge, and what's the role of like influence and authority and status in these like online worlds, and what grants you that authority and status. How do these things go viral? Is there like a limit to the standard influencing formula that we've kind of hit because of COVID in some way?
I think it's interesting because I think there's a little bit of like controversy over what an influencer is and does. I'm not having controversy, but like it's not completely defined what an influencer is. So I find that interesting. I do know you're talking about the nuclear influencer, and I don't know all that much about nuclear energy, but I think the amount of attention she's garnered around the topic obviously stands out and is definitely a different way of relaying information. But in terms of like knowledge sharing and these peer-to-peers, I think influencer isn't all that defined. And so it's definitely a way to play with content. And I guess that's where you find like these really strange niche pockets of factoids or like explanations of things.
Like when you say influencer, like you mean just the fact that they have like a certain aesthetics and like are on certain platforms where you would expect to find influencers? Like what makes them an influencer? Or are they self-identifying as an influencer?
I think a lot of people self-identify as that, yeah. And I think Erica's way of framing it is more interesting, which is just like the wider scope of what influence can mean. I mean, we coin all these like weird words. Like influencer is such a bizarre word.
Like, why is she an influencer as opposed to a nuclear activist or something? Like, where is the boundary between an influencer and an activist here?
So I was thinking of them like monetized kind of, I don't know if corporatized is the right word, but at least like the monetized versions or whatever that involve creating shows of like of envy and aspirational like imagery and kind of monetizing the eyeballs that are created by like generating a feeling of envy. At least that's how I like define. And that's like a very narrow sliver. And I think Erica's way is more interesting. It's just like, what's this wider landscape of, I don't know, influence online? Like these things aren't defined just because there's one template that some marketing bro, wrote up a business plan for 7 years ago. Doesn't mean that that's like the only way it's going to happen.
I wonder if it just can mean, if we have to define it simply, just having a following, like a large percentage of which is like loyal to your perspectives or whatever, and being for hire makes you an influencer.
Was Jim Jones an influencer?
The original. For the Kool-Aid brand.
I can't wait for the first influencer who becomes a cult leader. That takes a few years, like to build up that kind of loyalty in your following. But the first Kool-Aid influence thing can probably be guaranteed to happen in a few years.
I don't know. I feel like Trump is kind of an influencer in some ways.
But there's like levels, right? He's also like clearly a celebrity as well. And I feel like that influencer kind of requires that you're not yet a celebrity, or you'd be called that.
Yeah, that's an interesting like distinction between the two, like celebritization versus influencer. Also, there's like things that are made for the influencer, like those vlogging cameras that are like have that really bright light that shine on the face, like, and make the influencer glow or whatever. Those are specifically made for a certain content creator. So I don't think if you necessarily have that like light and that camera that makes you an influencer, but it definitely is something that like shapes the culture around an influencer. In terms of, again, that specific influencer, the way she's describing the information is not in a setting that you would necessarily see someone talk about nuclear energy, which is really cool to see actually. And I think engages it in a different way than the average person would maybe entertain that kind of information.
It's interesting to see how she's usually using like influencer tropes. So like skincare, you're coming to see the skincare routine, but then she's like spreading this message about nuclear energy. Not subliminal, but
Trojan horse.
Yeah.
I'm interested to just, if we like break this down into what like the component parts are here and not worry too much about definition of influencer here. Like difference is like typically we're used to seeing consumer products being peddled by influencers, I think. It may not be entirely true. Like there's probably been political propaganda. There's been, various other instances where influence is being sold to organizations or companies or whatever by influencers. In this case, it's not a particular product. It's not a consumer product, not even a company necessarily. It's a technology, and specifically, like it's a very interesting technology because it's one that sort of has generally speaking, probably a reputation as unsafe, and that there are people who seriously believe that it's gained that reputation unfairly and that it's actually like a very viable technology. And so you have somebody marketing it, not from a B2B perspective or a traditional B2B perspective at all, but in a way that's about gaining public acceptance of this technology. And that's the thing I think that's new, right? Like, can influencers start to be used to sway public opinion about potentially consent potentially? So like, and what other things would that be? Like, will you start to see more around like potentially like biohazardous technologies, to the return of the hybrid aircraft, which could happen, like influencers riding around in blimps, and which is like another technology that has kind of been killed because of public opinion due to like one major crash.
Right. But it's like one thing to bring back like a menu item at McDonald's, which is what people have done using this sort of like public opinion, versus the risks involved with something like nuclear technology. And like the question that I have is like what is the level of discourse here, and like what kinds of things is the person saying?
The performance is also very like high femme. The things that she ends up doing while she's speaking about the topic. There's another YouTuber who also does something similar where she applies makeup while like telling stories of true crime. It's like a very feminized act, but you're then discussing something completely different. I think the combination of the two is the act is very like influencer like, and then the content is almost a little displaced or different than what you would assume they'd be talking about.
I mean, we're talking about it because it's a juxtaposition to see this like influencer aesthetics with nuclear, I guess.
I mean, I think Uda, for the purpose of the conversation, you can just assume that she has a very nuanced way of talking. I don't think it matters. Like somebody like her who is very nuanced, like could emerge, and like the same questions would be at play. Juxtaposition that Erica mentioned is like quite interesting as like an aesthetic vibe and cue. It makes me think of Naomi Wu, who does this stuff with like the cyberpunk body hacking kind of things
right.
in China, and she like calls herself like a cyborg and all that stuff. I think
But
it's interesting.
don't you think like the topics at play are like change what this is? Like I mean, what Naomi Wu is doing is very different from what this person is doing because of like the risks involved, like of what nuclear is and what it could be. Like I'm necessarily saying that nuclear is something that we should go after or not, but I think it's like just the risks are completely different.
Yeah, but I don't know what are you talking about, like judging it as being like ethically good or bad? Like it's happening, it's going to continue to happen, so the effects of it are going to be present. Yeah, I think it changes the stakes. I think that's what's interesting about it. It's like, what if you can hype these like weird technologies into existence that were, like Rob was saying, like considered written off for a while for some reason, and you could like bring back certain versions, or like how does the public get involved in participating in the direction of like investment and energy in technologies? Like what role does the public play in that stuff? Because right now it's often like private investments are the things that direct research. At least like the development stuff happens from private. Maybe the more fundamental research still is like the state directing it, but the state doesn't involve the public that much in determining what those courses are.
Okay, I'll tell you why I think it feels different to me. So nuclear to me is like a technology which is fundamentally centralizing power, right? Because you can only have so many nuclear reactors. You can only have so many sources of extracting uranium, plutonium, or whatever the sources are that make this. So the way you're framing this around it being this sort of populist thing where like people, the public, have control over and can shape this new direction is, I think, not true. Like I think like the technology itself is extremely centralizing power in the same way that you can think of oil. Like the public doesn't really have control over like where oil is extracted. There are only a few sources, and it creates certain political dynamics because of the power arrangements that fall out of it. And I think that's where I'm like, I don't think it's the same thing. I don't think we can talk about Naomi Wu and like this person in the same conversation. I think they're very different things.
I wasn't saying this is like empowering to the public. I was just saying this is like a different way of engaging the public. And it's like, what the question is like, this is happening. So what is the shape of it going to be, and how is it going to affect the direction of research? With the nuclear thing, just to like put a pin in the question of centralizing, like money is also like a centralized thing. I don't think a lot of people who advocate for decentralization always advocate for like a proliferation of like a barter system that involves no money. Like you need to have a centralized sort of mechanism for doing a lot of stuff. And you could think of power the same way. If it just becomes a utility that's just freely available, it's a different political economy.
I would hope that the attention that it's bringing allows people to like seek out more in terms of that research that you were mentioning, or seek out more information about the landscape, because I think the current way it's being presented is an advocacy for it, and it's a different age group that would typically be engaging with the topic. I just think that it opens the field of dialogue about what goes on in nuclear then.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's maybe a tendency right now to feel concerned over something like this because of like the recent years of like fake news and the way that like a distribution of people's opinions about and the potential to weaponize that same technology has been has been weaponized. But overall, like there's good and bad that comes from that. And at this point, this overall seems good. Like it's one person participating in a conversation where like why should this conversation be reserved to the opinions of Bill Gates and Stuart Brand and whoever else is weighing in? And, like in general, I think the reasons why most people are against nuclear, I don't think are very well informed. You know, it's just sort of a general view. To say nothing about whether they're right or wrong. I don't feel informed enough to have a particular opinion on whether I think nuclear is a good or bad technology or whether we should pursue it and to what extent. Like I don't feel like I have the answers, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of instances where technologies get a reputation one way or the other based on pretty like incidental events that occur.
The point I was making before, and I think maybe I missaid what I was trying to say, which is that if the point you're trying to say is that this is something that gives people a seat at the table, I'm not sure if nuclear is one of those technologies where like everybody should, first of all, should have a seat at the table, and also everybody, like if that's even possible at all, because there's like such limited ways you can interact with, how the energy is produced. There are only so many reactors that are going to be created and so on. And so that's where I'm like, I don't know if thinking about it as like a way of giving people power is like the right like lens for looking at this whole thing.
I don't know if it's power, but regardless, the buy-in of the public does have influence over whether these projects are pursued. Not only that, but influencer may have an effect on what types of projects young people go and study and what types of science and engineering programs they spend their time and money, so I think it will have an effect. I think in that way, it's like there's a signal. And in terms of having a voice in it, like maybe this is the point Valdez was making, like how many reactors can be created? It seems like a different question. Like you may be right about who ends up with economic control, political control over these things after the fact. But in terms of getting these projects started or done or keeping that from happening, like there's a certain amount of influence that like voters have, and public acceptance is pretty important to whether technologies are pursued. And often people are underinformed about those questions.
Yeah, I think it's just in general opening up like often siloed conversations, and like it's almost at a base level just awareness like within a demographic that normally might not be having those conversations.
To disagree a little with Rob, like when you mentioned that it's maybe certain incidental events that cause the downfall of nuclear specifically, it's also decades of like certain forms of activism and revelations to turn the tide of public opinion against the technology that many people thought was both like economically not the smartest move, like it just doesn't actually work as well as people thought it did to produce energy. And then also issues like what Uda brought up around, okay, maybe there's questions of centralized economic control, and then obviously the certain forms of risk accounting that might be overblown or might not, depending on how you want to think about tail risks and stuff like that. But just to say that there was like decades long efforts to shut it down, stretching from the dawn of the nuclear age in the 50s until it ended in 3 Mile Island mostly and Chernobyl.
Fair. Yeah.
And so this like recent one is just part of that long process of now like shifting the tide in the other direction. And this is like an effort to start moving the ball back, because this is all these projects are decades long projects. These aren't, I mean, that's like my question is the temporality of influencing is so near term. You want to get a hot dog on the McDonald's menu, you can, that'll take like 3 weeks or whatever. But this nuclear thing we're talking like the scale of investment and energy and effort, and before you start seeing returns, like it's so long term. It's interesting, I think, to think about the relationship of those time scales.
I question the influence in terms of it just being like there's not many spin-offs of like nuclear influencers, so far we've like talked about like that there is a heavy impact, where I'm not necessarily sure there is all that much of a heavy impact or influence.
The nuclear fallout.
Yeah, I just don't know if that type of conveying maybe has all that much sway. Maybe that's a little towards what Udit was mentioning.
Lightning round, signal or noise. Udit.
Oh, for sure it's a signal. I think it's really interesting.
Erica, signal or noise?
I'd say signal, yeah. Signal.
Macy?
Signal.
Signal. Yeah, I like it as a signal, sort of. I like it as a category, a new category, which like the first time Valdez mentioned this, he sort of like framed it as something that was like by virtue of like what the headline is, a Vice article. I quite like the idea of having like signals, trends, drivers, Vice articles. And there's like a special sort of alchemy that makes something a Vice article. And when you hear nuclear influencer, you can immediately categorize it as Vice article, which maybe is like a specific type of noise, but there's a signal embedded or something like that. But I thought that was like a cool like categorization that may have not been intentional from Valdez when it came up.
If you guys all said signal, I was going to disagree and be like, this is definitely noise. This is a self-fulfilling Vice prophecy.
Deked out by Valdez on this. Yeah, nice. Udit Vera, Macy Sue, Erica White, Valdez Sillins. I'm Robert Bolton. Broadcast from later.